Berge is the third official full-length album released by Paysage, but in practical terms it's really the 11th full-length, or even the 12th if you include the Schnee compilation, which I do because the 4 Schnee songs belong together on a single release. So Berge is actually the 12th PDH album. So I'm speaking in May 2025. Berge was released in November 2024, which is just over 6 months ago. 2 tracks were released early, so we have been spending time with this release for about 9 months now. I didn't listen to the second track when it was released early. I considered that to be too much of a spoiler to have 2 tracks, and I was quite happy with Urgrund, and I imagine I'll mention that song again later in this video. So Berge is the second double album released by Paysage, following Wald from 2020. I do think of albums in terms of CDs, and some people, perhaps millionaires, still go for vinyl, and I imagine I'll naturally allude to double albums later on in this video. It seems inevitable really. Now Berge is a pretty daunting prospect once you start trying to fully absorb it and make sense of the experience. For comparison, I found Wald, which was also a double album as I just said, I found that one quite accessible. That's my recollection anyway. But with this album, you start with Urgrund, which is over 18 minutes long, and then the next track is over 15 minutes. The album is over 100 minutes, so at this point you're 2 songs in, 30 minutes in, and you've got a 3-track cycle next where the tracks are linked together, and that's a half an hour experience itself. So if you factor in the style and the length, and then also the context and what Wintherr was trying to do with this album conceptually, he was potentially closing a project that's been running for over 20 years, and it also follows an album that didn't perhaps have the same impact that other Paysage releases have had. So it strikes me that there's a weight and a significance to this one that we haven't had before, and perhaps increased the stakes to a degree, and I think the album really reflects that. So it did take a few months for me to understand the journey of this album, or to get a very distinct picture of it in my mind, but I can do that now obviously. That's why I'm talking about it, that's why I'm doing my review, so I can break it down. On the basic level, there are 7 songs, 5 on disc 1, 2 on disc 2. 3 of them can be listened to on their own at any time, as well as part of the album, part of the concept, and then the other 4 tracks are thematic and move the concept of the album forward. And I've read the lyrics, I have checked them, by which I mean I ran them all through Google Translate so I could read them, and all of the lyrics relate to the overarching theme of the album, which is the wanderer on his journey to the summit of the mountains, where he will transcend into the next form of beingness. I didn't get that from the CD unfortunately. I thought it should have stated that somewhere in the artwork. I think I got it from Metalum, a version of that. And also it's the final journey in the realm of Paysage, it says, so maybe it's the last album, who knows. But I would say that musically 4 tracks reflect the theme of the album, whereas the other 3 songs can be enjoyed just as much out of context as they can be in context. For example, the songs that were released early. That's my evidence for that claim. Also, there are no fully ambient tracks here, which is worth noting, so there are no big gaps between the metal songs like we might have had on other albums, like Wald for example. The final track on disc 1, which is Transcendence 3, that is quite ambient for the first few minutes before the instruments come to life. Then it's kind of a slow and tragic sounding piece, and then it fades out quite slowly, which brings the first half of the record to a close, so there is a separation between the 2 sides, whichever format you're listening to. So, I've just mentioned Transcendence. Those are tracks 3, 4 and 5 on disc 1, the final 3 tracks, so I would call it the Transcendence cycle. I don't need to say too much about them. They are good tracks, slower and more contemplative perhaps than the others. And then the second track on disc 2, the second of 2 tracks, that completes the album, that's Gipfel, and that picks up the theme from Transcendence. And actually the song before it leads neatly into Gipfel, so that's really where you'll feel the full weight of the concept of the Wanderer's journey. That's my experience of the album at a high level. But then the other 3 songs, which I'm saying can be enjoyed on their own. Firstly, the opener Urgrund. It's 18 minutes, as I said earlier. A beautiful choice for the earlier release, by the way, because it's distinctly Paysage-ish, and it immediately lets you know after the Geister album that it's a return to a similar area as Das Tor and Wald, which I think of as the classic PDH sound, or as close as we've had to one, because it has varied a lot over the years. I'd also say the vocals have a particularly strong presence on Urgrund, because they are deep and cavernous growls, which actually reminded me of the runes of Beverast, maybe a song like God's Ensanguined Bestiaries from the Foully Seaman album. And the music's not a million miles away from that vibe either, although it is clearly and unmistakably Paysage, and those vocals are only delivered on that first track Urgrund, and then they are actually quite varied across the whole album, so I think of them as a texture or a layer rather than what a frontman usually does, especially as I can't follow the lyrics. I'm not singing along with Wintherr, unfortunately, which I'd love to do because I enjoy shrieking along with my favourites, but Wintherr does expertly deploy those different sounds and techniques across the whole album. There's one point for example that reminds me of the strangled croak from Nacht, if you're familiar with that album and that reference, but in any case Urgrund is godly. It's a godly track, it's very much classic PDH, so that's how this album gets started. And then we're into Verina Leikung. That's the second track that was released early, although I didn't listen to it early, as I said earlier. here, but this is the best song here. It's top 10 Paysage and probably top 5 to be honest. Not that I'm planning to revisit that list, but this song has got a lot of Schnee 4 in it. That's the vibe, that's the level we're working at, Schnee 4. And it took a few plays, but there was a moment when it landed and it clicked and I realised I'd been given another very special song. It's the storm of Paysage hitting you with its maximum impact, and to be specific, it's when that main riff arrives. You'll know what I'm talking about if you know the song. It gives me an ecstatic feeling, it's actual ecstasy and transcendence, and the song's quite long as well, and there's a point in it where I'm wondering if I can cope with music this good for this long, and that's a feeling you can only get from special music from a very special artist. That's my understated opinion of Verena Leikung, that it's just too good for this world. So finally there'll be a word about Ausstieg, which is the first track on disc 2, and the obvious point here is that this one is very reminiscent of Macht der Schicksal from Das Tor, another one of my very favourite Paysage tracks. I previously said that the first song on the second disc of Wald, which is Le Rêve Lucide, I said it didn't stand out in the way I thought it probably should, as it starts off a new disc or a new section of the album. That is completely reversed here because this is a huge track, and it does make it so each disc feels important in its own right, because they both start with these essential and epic and quite ambitious songs. So yes, the album succeeds as a complete piece of work, but you can also enjoy each disc or each side or each half, whatever format you're listening to. You can enjoy them on their own if you don't have time for the full album, the full story, which is like an hour and 40 minutes long. And Ausstieg is another 18-minute track that leads into the finale, of course, Gipfel. It does actually start to point towards that song as it gets towards the end. And then Gipfel does sound like a man reaching the summit of a mountain to ascend to another realm, a spiritual and a metaphysical journey as well as a physical one, I would suggest. So my overall perspective, in case it hasn't become clear, is that this is another masterful release on Paysage and a return to the more familiar territory, the familiar worlds of Das Tor and Wald and Schnee, of course. And I said return, but it could actually be the end of the project, so enjoy it while it lasts. That's my advice. And I guess I should end with saying where it belongs in the Paysage rankings. Now this one has only been out for about 6 months, so there's still time for it to grow even further in my esteem, and I think that mainly depends on how the Transcendence tracks perform and mature in time. So at this point I wouldn't put it above the established leaders, which is of course Das Tor and Winterkaelte and the Schnee album. I'd say I'm finding it very equal to Wald. That feels about right. It's got a very different feeling to Wald, especially considering there are no fully ambient tracks here. There are a couple of instrumental moments maybe, but the albums are pretty equally joyous and satisfying listens. So in there at number 4 feels like the right holding position until a final decision can be made on whether it goes above or below Wald, and I've got my suspicions. So that's it. That's my review of Berge after 6 months of listening to it. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something as always. If you've got any comments or observations about Berge, by all means leave them in the comments section. I'd be interested to hear them. I will be back soon with more videos, but in the meantime enjoy the rest of your day.